Jay, thanks for being our first return guest today on the Uber to the Pits podcast. How are you holding up during the red flag season right now?
Hanging in there, working from home, missing racing, watching iRacing on TV, and I think I'm about one day away from the end of the internet.
How interesting has that iRacing been for you?
It's been pretty interesting, and on the helmet side, so I'm not followed iRacing at all. I'm not going to lie to you until this happened. And the helmet company that Simpson owns, that I represent, Stilo, actually came out with a VR helmet, one that accepts a VR headset. And
The
I
Oculus headset.
Yeah, the Oculus Rift, and all of a sudden I had tons of inquiries. So it was something, and needless to say, we didn't have any in the U.S. because we didn't know that there was going to be a market for them. And honestly, there wasn't that big a market, Chris, until the virus hit, and all of a sudden everybody was stuck at home. But it's neat. It's not the same as real racing, but it's neat, and I get it for drivers. It gives them an opportunity to kind of stay in tune and stay up on things, and keep their abilities at top level. And so I think it's going to grow more and more since we've all been stuck at home.
Yeah.
That it was going to take off anyway, but this is giving it all a big boost.
And, I know that through the SRO America series they've been running, I think there are two races they've won have also been, both have been run by straight sim racers. Not
Good.
somebody that's actually in a real car, but
Yeah.
just somebody that spends their time doing the e-racing. But doing the e-racing, they don't have to actually worry about one piece of device, and the device that we're going to actually be talking about today, and that's head and neck restraints.
Yep.
Simpson, who owns the Hans device as well as manufactures the hybrid device,
Correct.
which are two really important devices, whether you're driving your street car on the track or your race car on the track and have harnesses. The added weight of the helmet is something that a lot of people don't take into consideration. So, I brought Jay back because, he talked to us about steel helmets, and now we're going to talk head and neck restraints and help people really understand what the importance of them are. I think there's a lot of people that understand that they have to have them for certain situations, but they don't necessarily fully understand what it is.
Right.
So, Jay, if you want to give us a little bit of, I know that you've been tied with Hans for a while. If you want to give us a little bit of a history of what Hans is and how it came about.
Sure. So I'm from Atlanta, Georgia originally, and my background is really more in sports car. Started off with a little Datsun 510 that I used to first autocross and then did some solo racing with, and then eventually did a couple of the Walter Mitty challenges. But being from Atlanta and living in the Chamblee, Georgia area, which is a suburb outside of Atlanta, I was very familiar with Jim Downey, who was a longtime IMSA, SCCA and IMSA racer, basically ran Mazda's car program over here in the U.S. And I was working for Jim in another capacity. He's got a facility in Chamblee called Mosmart, and I was working for him there. The race team was based next door, and this would have been back in the mid 80s, mid to late 80s. Anyway, yeah, mid to late 80s. Jim showed up one day with this contraption, the original Hans device. And long story short, what had happened, Jim's brother-in-law, Bob Hubbard, who was a biomechanical engineer, was also a member of Jim's pit crew. Jim was known for being one of the most frugal racers on the
Wait,
most.
there's frugal racers?
Yeah, Jim's extremely frugal. Most of his employees, most of his crew members were Georgia Tech students who had aspirations to be in the racing industry. And so he would basically give them internships, which meant very low salaries, or family members, which Bob Hubbard was. Bob was his brother-in-law. And Jim and Bob were at a test. It was called Champion Spark Plug Series. A driver named Patrick Jacquemart was testing in a Renault, and he had what seemed to be a very minor accident, and it was he put the car nose first into a dirt embankment, and everybody expected him to climb out, and as it turned out, he suffered a basilar skull fracture, and he died. And what happens, Chris, with the basilar skull fracture is the the body is held in place by the belts, but like you said, with the extra weight of the helmet, the forward head swinging motion causes the base of the spine, where the spinal cord connects to your brain stem, to break, and it's a fatal accident. So Patrick had suffered this accident. Patrick was a good friend of Jim's, and his brother-in-law Jim Downing had Bob Hubbard had actually designed the heads on the crash test dummies that the National Highway and Transportation and Safety Administration were using in sled testing for passenger cars. And Jim started doing a little bit of research and realized that the basilar skull fracture was the number one cause of fatalities for all racing drivers in all racing series. And this was nothing new, but back in these days, you got to remember, in the early 80s and in even 90s, they were still under the presumption that racing is dangerous and people are going to die, and that's what happens, and it's just part of the sport.
Yeah.
It's a risk that we take. Jim, though, did the research. He saw that this was a very common injury, and he looked at his brother-in-law and he said, we should be able to come up with something to prevent this accident. So Bob had gone home and made the first Hans device out of plaster of Paris and coat hangers at his living room table. And the idea was to make something that would keep the head from swinging forward, that, however, would not limit side-to-side head movement. And at that time, the original Hans were huge. We were talking about this before we started. You've seen the original one.
Yeah.
It came all the way around the side of the helmet. And the idea of that, the acronym Hans stands for head and neck support. The original one was used as much as a head support in endurance racing, IMSA, as it was anything else, because at that time there was no such thing as full containment seats.
No,
so
and
nothing to keep the head up in these. You think about the 24 hours of Daytona and the G-forces that they're going through the corners. There was a lot of loads on the driver's neck.
Really, the best way I can describe what the original Hans looked like is the late, or maybe actually mid to late 90s, the safety devices that offshore boat racers wore.
Right.
Kind of like their life jackets with like the big surrounding up there. So when I saw the first, carbon fiber Hans prototype, that's exactly what it reminded me of, was an offshore boat racing safety device.
Yep. And so, it just so happened it was kind of fortuitous. Jim was also one of the first guys in the U.S. that was making carbon fiber parts for racing. He was actually making the front nose cones for the Porsche 962s. He had a carbon fiber shop right there in Atlanta by the race shop. And so Bob came up with this design, and Jim made one in his carbon fiber shop. And like we said, it's a lot different than the device that's sold today. If anybody were to Google original Hans, you can probably find a picture of it. It almost looks like a horse yoke. And when he came in with it, everybody in the race shop was like, what in the hell is that? And what are you doing? And they were truly dedicated to making this thing work. They saw the need for it. They had the ability to make it. And so Jim was pretty much the test dummy for the first 10 years. A lot of people think that the Hans device came out after Dale Earnhardt died.
No.
Nothing could be further from the truth. At that point, they were close to 20 years into this project, at least 15 years.
Yeah.
And they had, I think at the time Dale Earnhardt died, they had sold 10 devices. There was a couple of drivers in IMSA. It's funny, one of the first drivers in IMSA to adopt it was Paul Newman. The first accident, the first real world accident that it ever was tested in was a offshore, an unlimited hydroplane.
Okay.
So, yeah, but I went from so I was working with Jim, or working for Jim, not for the race team in this other capacity when the first Hans came out, and I saw that. Long story short, I moved up to Indianapolis because I wanted to work in the racing business, and I'd been selling auto parts for years. So I worked for a company that made hose and fittings. I ended up moving back to Atlanta in 2002, and Jim, the Hans was just starting to take off, and he needed some help. So I went back to work for him as an employee of Hans, and that's kind of what kick-started my career in the motorsport safety industry.
Yeah. Well, talking about Dale Earnhardt, because like you said, the Hans has been around for 15, maybe 20 years prior to his death in 2000. And
Yep, 2000, 2000, yeah,
yeah,
2000, 2001. Anyway,
right in there. And I know, I've heard the story that Jim tried to get Dale to adapt and wear a Hans, and he just felt like it was uncomfortable, or
well, so here's the story behind that. Before Dale Earnhardt died, there were actually five other deaths in NASCAR of the exact same injury. People may be familiar with Adam Petty, who
mm-hmm.
was Mr. Petty's grandson, and Kenny Irwin and Tony Roper and Blaze Alexander. All these people had died of the same injury. There was probably five drivers at that Daytona 500 who were wearing Hans devices. Bob was the one that went down to Daytona, Bob Hubbard, and he was told. Story that I heard from Bob is he was told when he got there, you can talk to anybody you want, but don't go talk to Dale Earnhardt. He doesn't want to have anything to do with this. And you got to remember, Dale Earnhardt was more or less the Ayrton Senna of NASCAR.
Yeah.
He was their biggest driver. He was their biggest hero. And I mentioned Senna because Senna was what really changed. I think Senna's death was the beginning of what would become radical changes in the racing industry as far as safety goes.
No, absolutely. Because I know the following year after Senna's death, the height of the helmet can be exposed was a big one, and
started changing, and that's where the original Hans device changed too. It was interesting. We're backtracking from Dale here, but just to kind of give a history on how the Hans wound up in racing, how it became more widely accepted. So after Senna's death, and anybody that looks at pictures of those cars will see, like we were saying, the whole top of the driver's body was exposed.
Yeah.
It had the shoulders. So they had there was a guy named Roland Ratzenberger that died.
Yeah,
and later.
Him and Senna died on the same weekend. Ratzenberger died during practice or qualifying.
Yep, and then Senna died that weekend.
Yeah,
and and just like NASCAR received so much negative publicity from the press and inquiries after Dale Earnhardt died, the same thing happened in Formula One after Ayrton died. And both series, to their credit, so realized we can't, it's tough enough to lose somebody, but we can write it off as it's racing and it's going to happen. But when it starts happening to everybody's hero, it's a different story. Then everybody wants to know what can be done to fix this. So F1 contracted Mercedes-Benz to help redevelop the cars to be safer and to look at ways to prevent the basilar skull fracture. They already recognized that this was it was the most common form of fatalities. So Mercedes-Benz was actually working on airbags for Formula One cars. They were trying to test airbags. Now you got to remember, up until this point, they also didn't have any way to sled test a race car. The only sled testing they had was used for passenger cars, so it was done at about 35 or 40 miles an hour, which is not going to give an accurate it's not going to give accurate information of what happens in a race crash at 150 miles an hour. Change of velocity can be the same, but it can be a lot greater in a race car. So anyway, Mercedes-Benz had finally come up with a test rig that would replicate a race accident with an open cockpit car, and they were working on airbags. The problem with an airbag was it deploys once, it's a one and done deal. And we all know that when a race car crashes, most of the time it's like a pinball.
Yeah.
It's it's more than one impact. It's two or three or multiple or more impacts. So they happen to have one of the original Hans devices that Bob Hubbard had sent a gentleman named Hubert Gramling, who worked for Mercedes, that was doing the testing for FIA. And just for grins and giggles, Hubert put it on the test dummy, and they did a sled test, and lo and behold, it provided sufficient protection to prevent a basilar skull fracture, which is exactly what they were looking for. So they ditched the idea of the airbag, and they immediately started working on making the Hans device smaller. Like we said, originally it was this big collar, or big yoke, giant piece around the head, and they said there's no way that we can adapt this to an open cockpit car. So they started whittling away at it, and the design that you recognize today when you see a Hans device, the square back, and the yokes that go over the shoulders, was pretty much created by Daimler Chrysler.
Wow.
And then the first series to mandate it was CART. CART mandated it after they had a driver named Gonzalo Rodriguez that died of a basilar skull fracture at Laguna Seca.
Yep, he went over the K-wall at going into the corkscrew.
He did. Yep, went straight over, and once again, didn't look that bad, but it's, I have to tell people, and early on, I worked at Hans from the early 2000s before it was mandatory anywhere, and just like Daytona, nobody wanted to wear it. Nobody. It's human nature not to want to do anything different than we've ever done before.
No.
That, and there was this really warped sense of mentality that, when it's my time, it's my time. And I can remember telling a NASCAR driver once the year that they mandated it. And every time it was mandated, first in CART, and then in F1, and then in NASCAR, all the drivers bitched and moaned. Most all of them complained and didn't want to use it, and they said they couldn't get comfortable. And it's funny now because I talk to drivers who've been wearing it since they were a kid, and I'll see them in a series where one of these few series in the world that still doesn't mandate head and neck restraints, and I'll say thanks for wearing it, and they're like, "What are you talking about? It's like gloves and a helmet. I wouldn't be in the car without it." So anyway,
and it's nice because once you're really strapped into the seat now, you don't really notice it.
You should notice it, and this is what I told people early on when I worked with them was, there's so many different models of head and neck restraints that are SFI approved now. There's only 2 that are FIA approved, but there's so many products out there. You should be able to find something that you can get comfortable in. And, so going back to NASCAR, after Dale died, first they allowed the Hans device and something called the Hutchins device, which was a bunch of straps. And it was trying to accomplish the same goal, which was without attaching the driver to the car. And this was funny. Early on, I'd have people, when I was at Hans, say, I can make something in my garage and just, hook the helmet to the roll bar. And I'd say, yeah, that's great, until the car is in a crash and the roll bar goes that way and your head's going this way.
Yeah.
Anyway, so they mandated these 2 pieces. And eventually in 2005, I went to the first NASCAR race I had ever been to. And that was the testing before the Daytona 500, and then the Daytona 500, because NASCAR had mandated that all drivers would have to wear a Hans starting at that race. And I think the 2 most difficult people I ever had to try and get comfortable were Tony Stewart and Rusty Wallace. And neither one of them had much to say. I think they called me everything but a child of God. You'd have thought that I was the Antichrist going in there.
But you'd think with Tony Stewart, because he had kart experience, that
Tony's old school. He didn't want to use it. I mean, he was so opposed to it. I remember the year before at the NASCAR banquet, he had been wearing the Hutchins because he said he couldn't get comfortable in the Hans, and there were some inherent issues with the Hutchins. It didn't provide the level of protection needed. It wasn't until SFI came out with a test, where they could actually create a standard for head and neck restraints. And the only one that met the standard early on was the Hans device. So anyway, Tony Stewart wore a Hutchins device over his tuxedo to the to the Cup Awards. And at that event, he and Rusty were just Rusty. God bless him. He was like a cat in a cardboard box. I don't think I've ever seen anybody so uncomfortable in my life. It was his last year in NASCAR. So I did all I could to get him comfortable and left, and they wore it. I noticed by July, Tony won the July 4th event, which at that time was down in Daytona.
Mm-hmm.
And he climbed the fence wearing his Hans. And I said, well, I guess he's comfortable. And then the next year, I was at the IndyCar test at Homestead. That was back during the IRL. And Rusty Wallace approached me in the pits. At that time, he was going to do commentating for ABC. And he approached me in the pits, and he said, hey, I don't know if you remember me. I'm Rusty Wallace. And I thought, yeah, I know exactly who you are. And I'm kind of surprised you remembered me, except that you didn't like me too much the last time we met. And he goes, oh, no problem. You know, I after 4 or 5 wrecks, I wouldn't get in a car without it. And I'm going to get to test Sam's car on the road course here so that I'll know what it's like to drive an Indy car. And I wanted to make sure that the device I was using in my Cup car will work in the Indy car. And I thought, well, there we go. That's proof that anybody can get comfortable in a head and neck restraint, just given the right amount of time and if they're patient enough to work with it. And Chris, the truth is 90, and you know this because you've sold Hans in the past, 90% of the people, once you put it on and you put the belts on, you don't even know it's there.
No. I'll tell you this. When I first started using a Hans back in 2003, 2002, there was another device out at the time called the R3.
Oh, yeah. And that was, okay, go ahead.
So, and, I was at a store, and I was shopping, we're looking for Hans, and the salesman was pushing us towards the R3 device.
Okay.
So, my uncle ended up getting the R3 device, and trying that on and then sitting in the seat, it was the most uncomfortable thing ever, because for people that don't know what the R3 device is, it ran up and down your spine. Yep. And then kind of strapped on, kind of similar to what the now hybrid device is. Yep. And that R3 device did not last very long with us.
Yeah, believe it or not, there's still people out there that got them. And when I was early on, one of the really tough markets for us to get into with Hans was drag racing.
Yeah.
And it's just because there was this mindset that, we're only in the car for 10 seconds at a time, and all we ever do is hit the wall. And
that's all it takes.
Right. Well, and I'd have to tell him, y'all don't crash often, but sometimes when you do, it's pretty violent. And so Trevor Ashline owned Safety Solutions, and they were our biggest competitor because they were selling the R3. And there was a lot of guys that were more comfortable in the R3 than they were at the Hans. And I still tell people today, I work for Simpson, and I represent Hans and Hybrid and Stilo. But there's 3 or 4 other head and neck restraints out there that all meet the certification. And, just like there's a head for every helmet, there's a head and neck restraint for everything. There should be able to get comfortable in something. And it's one of those deals where head and neck restraints are the only piece of driver safety equipment that don't have an end date. They have to be recertified every 5 years, but you can use it. If you race for 40 years, you can use it the entire 40 years. Mile per dollar, it's going to be the cheapest piece of safety equipment.
It's the best amortized piece of equipment you can get.
Absolutely is, and you can turn around and resell it to somebody or gift it to somebody that might need it when you get done.
I know it was 2016. I had a driver that we were talking with that finally ended up getting a new Hans device.
Right.
That still had the 2004, 2003 original carbon fiber Pro device.
Yep.
And just the weight difference alone between those two devices over the 12 years was incredible. As soon as he tried on the lighter device, he's like, I'm done. This is it. Just give it to me now.
It's funny, the composite Hans that we sell now, the Hans 3, is lighter than the original carbon fiber that we sold when I started with Jim Downing and with Hans. So yeah, here's the other. If you want to look at values, if you have an accident that wasn't necessarily bad enough to injure you fatally, but it injured you enough that you had to make a trip to the ER, I promise you, one trip to the ER, regardless of how good your insurance program is going to cost you more than what a head and neck
Yeah.
restraint would have.
And I mean, I know pricing of Hans, between the Sport 3, you're looking, you know, $400.
Yeah, for $450, 449.
Yeah, 449 for a composite entry level
Yep.
Hans device. And then, your top of the line Stilos 15.
Yep, 1400. Yep,
14.
1400. So, and the only difference between the two is weight.
Exactly.
That is the only difference. They both, then, and this is something that's interesting. I have to tell people, just like helmets and any other piece of safety equipment, just because two products have the same sticker on them, it means they met the same minimum requirement to meet that certification.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'm really proud of is that all of the Hans that we sell, whether it's the $450 entry level piece or the $1,400 Hans Stilo Zero, all perform exactly the same, which is well above the requirements to be FIA and SFI certified.
Yeah. So I know we've been talking, more about racing and Hans and stuff like that. I kind of want to shift gears a little bit right now to track day stuff.
Yep.
I know there's a lot of guys that are bringing their Porsches, their Ferraris, their Mustangs, their Camaros, that they bought from the dealer. Maybe just have done minor modifications to car. They want to take it to the track, but they still have 3-point seat belts. And, they're still putting on the helmet that weighs anywhere between, 2.5 to 5 pounds, depending on quality of helmet and how much they spend on it and what type of helmet they have. And I don't think people really even understand that the damage of, especially with the new safety belts, how they lock in place during an impact, can still have hate to say it, an effect in your neck and the strain and the danger that way. And I know that there's the Hybrid S that works with the 3-point harnesses.
And here's the story behind that. So, me being old school guy, I told you I started racing in the very early 80s, doing autocross and stuff. And back then, there was no such thing as track days.
Yeah.
You had two choices if you wanted to go race. You could go autocross, or you could eventually build a car and go race in SCCA. You couldn't take a car off the showroom floor and run laps around Laguna Seca or Road Atlanta or Road America on an open track. It did not happen. The first time I ever remember doing that was the Walter Mitty Challenge. Before that, you had to have a race car to be able to run the track wide open. So that being said, with the advent of track days, and then even more so with the advent of cars that off the showroom floor will outperform an IMSA GTO car from 10 years ago. Track day and track day safety has become really, really important. And what had happened as track days were becoming more popular, and most of the better track day groups usually have instructors. There's some progression that somebody that shows up has to go through. You want them to receive, and this is the whole benefit of track days too, man. When I started racing, you couldn't have anybody sit in the right-hand seat and tell you what you were doing wrong and what you were doing right, where to brake, where to accelerate, how to turn in, where the apex was, et cetera, et cetera. There was no instructors. The closest thing there was a couple of books that were available. So with the advent of track days and with the advent of right seat instructors, Inevitably, what happened was there was a couple of accidents where the instructors or the guy sitting in the right hand seat was killed.
Mm-hmm.
And um, so after Simpson had bought Hans, and I mentioned Trevor Ashline earlier, it was interesting for me because overnight my largest competitor became a sister product. It would be like if you worked at Ford your whole life and you came in one day and they said, "Hey, GM bought us and you're going to be working with everybody from GM tomorrow." So it was very interesting. So I had moved up here to North Carolina, which is where the hybrid product where Safety Solutions crew was based, the guys that were making the hybrid products, and the R3, which was the predecessor to the hybrid. Um, and somebody noticed that one of the large auto manufacturers up in Detroit was the what we call the Hybrid S now was originally the Hybrid Pro. It was the first hybrid unit. It was the first progression of the R3 into what is now the hybrid series. And basically, they had gotten rid of a lot of the long tail on the back, and it did have a load path on the shoulders for the belts to go over. Whereas the R3 had a very small one, this one was
Yeah.
a little bit larger, not as large as the yoke on the Hans, because the hybrid's held in place with straps, whereas the Hans basically is the yoke that fits over the neck.
Yeah, the
So anyway,
R3 kind of had like little bat wings to it in the
yep,
back.
just a couple of little pieces for the belts to go over. So the hybrid was, and I got some. We'll look at them here in a second. But anyway, we noticed that one of the large auto manufacturers in Detroit was ordering a substantial amount of these hybrid devices, and somebody had the wherewithal to call them and say, "What are y'all doing with these? Are y'all giving them to drivers? Because we're not seeing that many." You know, it was really popular in rally racing and drag racing. But outside of that, it hadn't gained much popularity in sports car or some other markets. And they said, "Oh, no, we're using them for our OE vehicles for testing engineers." And before that, there had always been, back before social media, when there were forums everywhere for different groups, there was always chatter on the forums about should I wear my Hans or my R3 in my track day car. And when I was at Hans and we'd be questioned about this, we'd always tell them it's designed for a 5+ point seatbelt application. Uh, I can't tell you that it won't do anything, but we don't think it's going to have much effect with the 3. So this manufacturer said we're using them in the test vehicles, in testing passenger cars, and we said we don't know that it'll work with the 3-point belt. And they said, "Oh yeah, well we've already done the testing. It provides a 50 to 60% reduction in neck tensions." And we were like, "Really? We'd love to see that information." And so they provided it, and sure enough, that was the case. Because of the way the hybrid is, the Hans is the yoke, and it works strictly. You have to have one belt on each shoulder for it to be effective. Because the Hybrid S, which was the original hybrid, still has a little bit of a tail, doesn't go down nearly as far, and it's not nearly as intrusive as the R3 was. But because it's got that tail, and it uses straps to hold on to hold to the body, it basically works like a fulcrum, and it provides neck tension reductions in a 3-point belt. I'll always tell people that the absolute safest setup is a full containment seat and a 5+ point belt system. But that being said, there's a lot of people that are buying these really fast, really expensive new cars, or not so fast, not so expensive older cars with 3-point belts that are doing track day stuff.
Yeah.
And while the risk isn't nearly as great as it might be in a purpose-built race car in a race environment, the chance that it can happen is still there. And originally, we started originally selling lots of them to instructors, and then that kind of progressed. Understandably, the instructors also looked to by new students, new drivers, new participants in HPDE as mentors to tell them what kind of safety equipment they need And as they recommended the product more and more, we've seen a huge increase in the number of hybrid S's that are being used in 3-point belts in track days. It's gotten to the point now where, like PCA and BMW CCA, almost all the instructors, even if they have a Hans device that they prefer to use in a 5-point belt in their race car that's already set up with a full containment seat and a set of race harnesses, they'll have a hybrid that they use strictly when they're instructing. And then some of them even found out that they prefer the hybrid to the Hans for comfort reasons, and they'll use it in both applications. And it does work in both. It's the only one. It is the only head and neck restraint, the Hybrid S. Not the standard hybrid, but the Hybrid S with a longer tail on the back is the only one that's proven to work in a 3-point belt.
Yeah, I know I've had to recommend the hybrid to some gentlemen and that have been on the little bit of the larger side and have problems with the yoke, fitting right, pushing the helmet,
Yep.
because that's very important stuff is you want to be able to, it's not put the Hans on and pull it so it's all the way touching your helmet, because when you're in the car and if you belt yourself in that way, you're going to be pushing your head down. You're not, you're going to be looking to the steering wheel, not outside your windshield.
And that's where you have to look at different angles for the Hans device. A lot of times, even though the seat may be a 20-degree angle, because it's a big guy with a big chest, putting a 20 on, it'll lift it up and it'll end up either hitting the back of the seat or coming forward and hitting his head. And so some of the guys found out that the hybrid doesn't, you don't have to have a certain angle like you do with a Hans, certain angle device. Yeah. The hybrid in any angle, any seating position.
So, and you said you had a couple of the devices there, so we could show the difference between the Hans and the hybrid.
Yep, let me grab them here. So, this. So this is the original traditional Hans that most everybody is used to. This happens to be the newest one, the lightest Hans ever, the Hans Zero. And it fits over your shoulders, goes over your neck. Not like this, like I see some people trying. It's too small. It's like this. And then you'll have a couple of attachment points on the side of the helmet that are, and all newer helmets now come with the M6 nut washer. Yeah. Already bonded into the helmet. And that should tell you, if you're somebody new and you're not using a head and neck restraint, that should be your first clue that maybe it'd be a good idea to get one. The different safety certification houses think that they're important enough that now the helmets actually have to have the nut washers bonded into the helmet for it. And so there are several different types of attachments that can go on the tethers, but the tethers just attach to the anchor on the side of the helmet.
Yeah, I remember when we first started, we had to drill the helmets to put the anchors in.
Helmets. You slide the nut washer up in there, and all of that's done now. So that's the traditional Hans, and that will only work in a 5-point or more application. Now, I say 5 or more. There's still a few people out there that might have 4-point belts, and my advice to them is
get a 5-point.
Got a race harness, get a 5 or more, get a 6 or even a 7-point.
Because if you have that front load impact or rear end impact, you're most likely sliding through your belts and not being held in your seat.
And this is interesting for people that do want to go to something past a 4-point, which everybody should. I can tell you that all of the testing shows that a 6-point belt that actually has 2 sub straps instead of one in the center, has one on each side, is a lot easier on the boys in an accident.
Yep.
And that's kind of important if you're planning on having a family or practicing to have a family anytime in the future. And then this, of course, is the hybrid device. And it's worn like a backpack. It's got a strap on each side that your arm goes through. This is the Hybrid S. It's got a buckle in the front that connects, and it's adjustable, so you can adjust it where it's comfortable on your chest. And then it's also got a couple of tethers with ends, and there are several different ends available that attach to the helmet. And then the belts go over it here. And if you'll notice what we were talking about the hybrids, the Hybrid S actually has somewhat of a small tail in the back
Mm-hmm.
that goes probably a quarter, maybe halfway down the back. And that's what actually helps it work with the 3-point belts. And then the other hybrid product, which does not work with 3-point belts, is the newer hybrid, which is available either in a sport or pro model. The only difference is weight. And if you'll notice, it doesn't have the tail in the back. Other than that, it's the exact same design as the Hybrid S.
Now,
But that, go ahead.
the Hybrid Sport and the Hybrid Pro, those are just SFI rated devices, right?
No, they're FIA.
Oh, they are FIA.
They're,
Okay.
the Hybrid and the Hans are the only two head neck restraints that are both FIA and SFI certified.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, though, there used to only be one hybrid device that was FIA for a time being, right?
And that was this one,
Yep.
the original one. And that's it. You would see originally where we saw, and this was interesting, the original market that we saw that really adopted the hybrid for FIA was rally racing.
Yeah.
And they had, a lot of rally drivers. The rally environment is it's very rough. It's very brutal. You're doing a lot of moving around, and you can find pictures on the internet where somebody may not have had the belts mounted properly. They may not have had the proper device, and the Hans would want to get cocked, or one of the belts would want to slip off the edge. Of course, we've done a lot to fix that over the years. One of the things being the higher epaulets and the flatter load path for the belt to follow. But that being said, yes, this was the one that was originally called the Hybrid Pro, and it was FIA certified. Since that time, though, Chris, all of the hybrids have gotten both FIA and SFI certification. And it was interesting, when I was at the 24 Hours of Daytona this last year for 2020, I noticed that one of the teams came over to our dealer there, and they were buying hybrid devices, Hybrid Pro lights. And I knew that these drivers were already Hans customers because I had sold them Hans in the past. And, for me, it's kind of nice because they're not my competitor anymore. Now it's a product. So it wasn't like I was losing a customer. I was actually gaining a customer again. And I asked them, I said, I'm curious, are y'all uncomfortable on the Hans? And they said, no, this is the deal. One of the team members already had a hybrid. The other two had Hans. We noticed in driver changes, he was 5 seconds quicker than we were.
And that's what I was going to say with rally racing is that there's rallies where,
they're in and out of the car.
They have to get in and out of the car. They have to fix the tire. Same thing with the Dakar rally and
so they said we noticed that he was 5 seconds faster, and so what we did was we put the Hans on him, and we were the hybrid. He was 5 seconds slower then, and we were 5 seconds faster. So we figured out if we all switch to the hybrid, we can save, maybe a minute over the course of the entire 24 hours in driver changes. And while that may not seem like much, you and I both know that there have been finishes at the 24 Hours of Daytona in the last 10 years where the difference between first and second place was
less than a minute.
Less than a minute. So that could be, that might could win you the race or win you an extra spot up on the podium.
And, another series that I'm actually shocked about that just up until recently started requiring head and neck safety devices was off-road racing.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's and it seemed like a lot of these the hybrid really gained popularity in these series where there was a lot of movement or where and I'm not knocking drag racing because I love drag racing, been to many, and I know a lot of guys that drag race, but that's kind of an older mindset.
Yeah.
I don't like that. I don't want to do it because it feels different. Maybe the hybrid didn't feel quite as intrusive as they perceived the Hans to be. Not that I think either one of them are, but it's just, tomato, tomato. It's nice to have two different choices that both accomplish the same thing. And it's interesting to know, too, to keep in mind that, like I said, when the SFI first came up with testing, and they came up with a way to test. That was the first thing, was we got to figure out a way to measure the forces and make sure that any head neck restraint is actually is preventing the neck tension in the neck extension that we need to prevent to either reduce injury or reduce fatality. The R3 was the first device other than the Hans that passed that certification. And then the hybrid, and the hybrid, like I said, is the only other device other than the Hans that actually meets the FIA certifications too.
No.
And it's, if you buy a hybrid S and you start off doing just track days and you need it for a 3-point belt, one of the advantages is if at some point you decide to put a full harness in the car, you're not going to have to go out and buy another head and neck restraint. It's going to work.
No. And then I know that there's been times because of our dealings, I was talking to you about the Han Zero with customers. And
Yep.
what some people may not realize is that, you did mention here a little bit, but the Hans had different degree angles. I know for a while there was a 10 degree, 20, 30 degree, 40, depending on what the application was, where now our more popular angles have just been 20 and 30. That the way that the Zero is built is that a lot of guys and girls are able to use that Hans in multiple applications, whether it would have been a seat where they used to require a 30 degree or in a GT seat where it was easier to have a 20 degree.
Yep. And it was another one of the cases where I discovered this totally by accident. So when we came out with this model, the first angle that we came out with was a 30 because it was important. It was going to be our most expensive model ever. Well, I say that. It's only a couple of $100 more than the original Hans Professional was. They were $1,200 when they first came out. But anyway, we wanted to get it in open cockpit cars. We wanted to get it on a couple of F1 drivers and IndyCar drivers for maximum exposure. And I was at an event. I was at the 24 Hours of Daytona, actually. And I had a couple with me that I was showing those guys, telling them that we're working on, and a lot of the people don't realize these are not easy pieces to make. You have to make a mold, then you have to produce it, then you have to send it in for testing. Sometimes it takes several different variations to come up with the carbon layup in the right spot to get it to pass the test and perform where we want it to. And that being said, it's one thing to make one of these that weighs a lot, that we know provides that much protection. To get it to weigh this little and provide the same amount of protection is tough.
Yeah.
So that being said, we made the 31st, and I was showing it to some IMSA drivers, and they were very interested in it. And they said, when are you going to have a 20? And I said, I don't know, 6 months, a year maybe. It's going to take a while. And one of them said, well, can I try it on in the car? And so we did. And because of the way the newer Hans, and one of the things you'll notice about the Zero, it's got this very high cutout behind it. And the reason we did that was so on rebound, there was no chance of it contact on the forward motion and then the driver's head rebounding. We wanted to make sure there was no chance of this contacting the C-spine at the top of the neck. But because of that, it turns, and because it's actually closer to maybe a 25 degree than a true 30, we found out that the Zero actually fit in both GT applications, and in about 98% of the 20 degree applications I've tried it in, it works.
There you go. So that way you only need one device, like the hybrid, you only can need one device now.
A couple of people that couldn't use it in 20s, and we will have a 20 medium and a 20 large coming out eventually, but they're kind of on the back burner for right now, as long as the 30 fits most of the applications. And it was nice drivers that didn't have to have one device, because I had a lot of IndyCar drivers in open wheel that would go do sports car events, and they'd have to have another device to go do the sports car events. Now they got one.
And then not only that, but also with the Sport 3, because I think, and there's the medium, usually just a medium and large, but I know that Hans used to have a child size. Is that still there for parents where their kids are starting to get into midgets, quarter midgets, stuff like that?
The Hans is available in a youth size or an adult size, and in the adult size it's available in a 30 medium or a 20 medium, or a 20 large, or a 30 large. So we have a full size range of that $450 device. And I would encourage anybody that's doing track days or that races that has a kid that's getting into racing to put them in a head and neck restraint, whether it's a Hans or a hybrid. We make Child's hybrid devices or one of our competitors' product. Do it from day one.
Yeah.
And, here's the reason. Just like I had to fight with Rusty Wallace and Tony Stewart because they were never used to it. Then I have other drivers that started in quarter midgets. And this, we were discussing homeschooling and the event of the virus here earlier. It's the same reason you make your kids start doing homework in first grade instead of 10th grade. If it's a habit that you start early on, then it becomes a habit, and it's not one that you'll have to adapt later on, which will be a lot harder the older that you get. That, and God forbid anything should happen to your kid. You want them to have all the protection that they can get.
Now, that 100% true. And like we were talking about the amortized cost, you buy the base model Sport 3 at $450, or you buy the most expensive Stila Zero at $1,400. That product's not going to go bad. Whether it's the composite or the hand laid carbon, they're not going to disintegrate. They're not going to mold. They're not going to go bad. And what is it? Every 10 years?
Every 5 years?
Or every 5 years you go through the certification. You pay the $75.
70 to $100, and it's basically new rubber and new tethers on the Hans or hybrid, and you're good for another 5 years.
There you go.
There's nothing. It's just the amortized cost is there's nothing else that you're ever going to wear that's going to come close to it. And you had said they don't go bad. There's in all the years that I've been with Hans, I saw a device that got run over by a tow vehicle, and that destroyed it. I've seen them used as weapons when drivers get mad at each other. I've never seen one break from that.
Nope.
It will not work as a boomerang, though. Many drivers found that out. The only one that I've only seen two in the entire history that I was at Hans. I've only seen two that were damaged in an accident. They were hairline fractures, and I'll put it this way. The data from the accident definitely showed that it was bad enough that without a head and neck restraint, the driver would surely have died. And they were more than happy to spend the money on a new one.
Wasn't one of those accidents Clint Boyer's?
Actually, one of them was Jeff Gordon. Jeff Gordon had a really, really big crash early on, and there was a hairline fracture right in the back in the center. But it was like a 120G accident.
Yeah.
Clint Boyer may have had one too. There hadn't been many. There's been a few. And then I saw where Botas had an accident last year wearing one of your former employers' Hans devices, and it actually had some damage. But these were all really, really big hits.
Yeah, I thought the Clint Boyer one I saw had something to do where it broke where the sliding tethers were.
I think what you're thinking of was what happened was originally the Hans tether carriers were metal, and then later on when they started making the composite models, they switched to a plastic tether carrier, and now it's actually it's a different style. It's got plastic and metal in it, but what had happened was the tether carrier broke.
Yeah.
And that would not affect performance at all. It didn't affect the performance of the device in an accident. But there was a lot of scuttlebutt on the internet and around the pits about that. And so after that happened, we changed the design on the tether carriers just to ensure that there was no chance they'd ever break.
Yeah. So, well, I hope everybody got enough information on the Hans and hybrids, and if anybody has any questions about them, feel free to reach out to us here at Uber to the Pits podcast. I can get you in touch with Jay. I too can answer questions, as I've been worked with the product for numerous years as well. Make sure that we get you in the proper size, proper equipment, proper angle if need be, because if you may be in a weird application. Jay, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Chris. And you and everybody else stay safe. And hopefully, we all get to see each other at the racetrack really soon.
I know. It's weird. It's like, beforehand, you and I are talking about the iRacing a little bit too. And, I'm missing the smell of the fuel, the sound of the exhaust. And, I'm ready to get back and get in the pits and the camaraderie of everybody.
Absolutely.
So,
look forward to seeing you there soon. Thanks.
All right, Jay. Thanks a lot. And everybody, thanks for joining us on the Uber to the Pits podcast. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter at ubertothepits.com. Is our website. You can reach me at info@ubertothepits, as well as our new YouTube channel, Uber to the Pits. So you guys all stay safe, take care, and we'll see you next week with our special guest, Tommy Kendall.